Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling episode of Wicked Whispers, where the shadows come alive and nightmares whisper their secrets. Shortly after midnight on June 10, 1912, exactly 100 years ago this week, a stranger hefting an axe lifted the latch on the back door of a two-story timber house in the quiet Iowa town of Villisca. Crime was not a concern in this modestly prosperous Midwest settlement of 2,000 people, so the door was unlocked, allowing the intruder to slip inside silently and close it behind him. According to the town coroner's reconstruction the next day, the stranger took an oil lamp from a dresser, removed the chimney and placed it under a chair, bent the wick to minimize the flame, lit the lamp, and turned it down to cast only the faintest glimmer in the sleeping house. Still carrying the axe, the stranger walked past one room where two girls, ages 12 and 9, lay sleeping, and slipped up the narrow wooden stairs to two other bedrooms. He ignored the first room, where four more young children were sleeping, and crept into the room where 43-year-old Joe Moore lay next to his wife, Sarah. Raising the axe high above his head, so high it gouged the ceiling, the man brought the flat of the blade down on the back of Joe Moore's head, crushing his skull and likely killing him instantly. Then he struck Sarah before she had time to wake or register his presence. Leaving the couple dead or dying, the killer went next door and used the axe, Joe's own, probably taken from the coal shed, to kill the four more children as they slept. There is no evidence that Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, or Paul, 5, woke before they died. Nor did the assailant or any of the four children make sufficient noise to disturb Catherine's two friends, Lena and Ina Stillinger, as they slept downstairs. The killer then descended the stairs and took his axe to the Stillinger girls, the elder of whom may finally have awakened an instant before she, too, was murdered. What happened next marked the Villisca killings as truly peculiar and still sends shivers down the spine a century after the fact. The axe man went back upstairs and systematically reduced the heads of all six Moors to bloody pulp, striking Joe alone an estimated 30 times and leaving the faces of all six members of the family unrecognizable. He then drew up the bedclothes to cover Joe and Sarah's shattered heads, placed a gauze undershirt over Herman's face and a dress over Catherine's, covered Boyd and Paul as well, and finally administered the same terrible post-mortem punishment to the girls downstairs before touring the house and ritually hanging cloths over every mirror and piece of glass in it. At some point the killer also took a 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon from the icebox, wrapped it in a towel, and left it on the floor of the downstairs bedroom close to a short piece of key chain that did not, apparently, belong to the Moors. He seems to have stayed inside the house for quite some time, filling a bowl with water and, according to some later reports, washing his bloody hands in it. Sometime before 5 a.m., he abandoned the lamp at the top of the stairs and left as silently as he had come, locking the doors behind him. Taking the house keys, the murderer vanished as the Sunday's sun rose red in the sky. The Moors were not discovered until several hours later when a neighbor, worried by the absence of any sign of life in the normally boisterous household, telephoned Joe's brother, Ross, and asked him to investigate. Ross found a key on his chain that opened the front door but barely entered the house before he came rushing out again, calling for Villisca's marshal, Hank Horton. That set in motion a sequence of events that destroyed what little hope there may have been of gathering useful evidence from the crime scene. Horton brought along Doctors J. Clark Cooper and Edgar Hoff and Wesley Ewing, the minister of the Moors Presbyterian congregation. They were followed by the county coroner, Los Angeles linguist, and a third doctor, F.S. Williams, who became the first to examine the bodies and estimate a time of death. When a shaken Dr. Williams emerged, he cautioned members of the growing crowd outside, "Don't go in there, boys, you'll regret it until the last day of your life." Many ignored the advice, as many as 100 curious neighbors and townspeople tramped as they pleased through the house, scattering fingerprints and, in one case, even removing fragments of Joe Moore's skull as a macabre keepsake. The murders convulsed Villisca, particularly after a few clumsy and futile attempts to search the surrounding countryside for a transient killer failed to unearth a likely suspect. The simple truth was that there was no sign of the murderer's whereabouts. He might have vanished back into his own home nearby. Equally, given a head start of up to 5 hours in a town where nearly 30 trains called every day, he might easily have made good his escape. Bloodhounds were tried without success. After that, there was little for the townspeople to do but gossip, swap theories, and strengthen their locks. By sundown, there was not a dog to be bought in Villisca at any price. The most obvious suspect may have been Frank Jones, a tough local businessman and state senator who was also a prominent member of Villisca's Methodist Church. Edgar Epperly, the leading authority on the murders, reports that the town quickly split along religious lines, with the Methodists insisting on Jones's innocence and the Moores Presbyterian congregation convinced of his guilt. Though never formally charged with any involvement in the murders, Jones became the subject of a grand jury investigation and a prolonged campaign to prove his guilt, which destroyed his political career. Many townspeople were certain he used his considerable influence to have the case against him quashed. There were at least two compelling reasons to believe that Jones had nursed a hatred of Joe Moore. First, the dead man had worked for him for 7 years, becoming the star salesman of Jones's farm equipment business. But Moore had left in 1907, dismayed, perhaps, by his boss's insistence on hours of 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., 6 days a week, and set himself up as a head-to-head rival, taking the valuable John Deere account with him. Worse, he was also believed to have slept with Jones's vivacious daughter-in-law, a local beauty whose numerous affairs were well known in town thanks to her astonishingly indiscreet habit of arranging trysts over the telephone at a time when all calls in Villisca had to be placed through an operator. By 1912, relations between Jones and Moore had grown so cold that they began to cross the street to avoid each other, an ostentatious sign of hatred in such a minuscule community. Few people in Villisca believed that a man of Jones's age and eminence, he was 57 in 1912, would have swung the axe himself, but in some minds, he was certainly capable of paying someone else to wipe out Moore and his family. That was the theory of James Wilkerson, an agent of the renowned Burns Detective Agency, who in 1916 announced that Jones had hired a killer by the name of William Mansfield to murder the man who had humiliated him. Wilkerson, who made enough of a nuisance of himself to derail Jones's attempts to secure re-election to the state senate and who eventually succeeded in having a grand jury convened to consider the evidence he had gathered, was able to show that Mansfield had the right sort of background for the job. In 1914, he was the chief suspect in the axe murders of his wife, her parents, and his own child in Blue Island, Illinois. Unfortunately for Wilkerson, Mansfield turned out to have a cast-iron alibi for the Villisca killings. Payroll records showed that he had been working several hundred miles away in Illinois at the time of the murders, and he was released for lack of evidence. That did not stop many locals, including Ross Moore and Joe Stillinger, father of the 2 Stillinger girls, from believing in Jones's guilt. The rancor caused by Wilkerson lingered on in the town for years. For others, though, there was a far stronger, and far stranger, candidate for the axe man. His name was Lyn George Jacklin Kelly, and he was an English immigrant, a preacher, and a known sexual deviant with well-recorded mental problems. He had been in the town on the night of the murders and freely admitted that he had left on a dawn train just before the bodies were discovered. There were things about Kelly that made him seem an implausible suspect, not least that he stood only 5'2" and weighed 119 pounds, but in other ways, he fit the bill. He was left-handed, and Coroner Lindquist had determined from an examination of blood spatters in the murder house that the killer probably swung his axe that way. Kelly was obsessed with sex and had been caught peering into windows in Villisca 2 days before the murders. In 1914, living in Winner, South Dakota, he advertised for a girl stenographer to do confidential work, and that ad, placed in the Omaha World Herald, also specified that the successful candidate must be willing to pose as a model. When a young woman named Jessamine Hodgson responded, she received in return a letter described by a judge as so obscene, lewd, lascivious and filthy as to be offensive to this honorable court and improper to be spread upon the record thereof. Amongst his milder instructions, Kelly told Hodgson that she would be required to type in the nude. Investigation soon made plain that there were links between Lyn Kelly and the Moore family. Most sinister, for those who believed in the little preacher's guilt, was the fact that Kelly had attended the Children's Day service held at Villisca's Presbyterian Church on the evening of the murders. The service had been organized by Sarah Moore, and her children, together with Lena and Ina Stillinger, had played prominent parts, dressed up in their Sunday best. Many in Villisca were willing to believe that Kelly had spotted the family in the church and become obsessed with them, and that he had spied on the Moore household as it went to bed that evening. The idea that the killer had lain in wait for the Moores to go to sleep was supported by some evidence. Lindquist's investigation had revealed a depression in some bales of hay stored in the family barn and a knothole through which the murderer could have watched the house while reclining in comfort. That Lena Stillinger had been found wearing no underwear and with her nightdress drawn up past her waist did suggest a sexual motive, but doctors found no evidence of that sort of assault. It took time for the case against Kelly to gain traction, but in 1917, another grand jury finally convened to hear the evidence linking him with Lena's murder. At first glance, the case against Kelly seemed compelling. He had sent bloody clothing to the laundry in nearby Macedonia, and an elderly couple recalled meeting the preacher when he alighted from a 5:19 a.m. train from Villisca that June 10. They reported that he had mentioned gruesome murders in the town, a highly incriminating statement, given that Kelly had left Villisca 3 hours before the killings were discovered. Moreover, Kelly had returned to Villisca a week later, showing great interest in the murders and even posing as a Scotland Yard detective to obtain a tour of the Moore house. In 1917, Kelly was arrested and repeatedly interrogated. Under pressure, he eventually signed a confession to the murders, stating, "I killed the children upstairs first and the children downstairs last. I knew God wanted me to do it this way. Slay utterly came to my mind, and I picked up the axe, went into the house and killed them." However, he later recanted this confession, and the couple who claimed to have spoken to him on the morning after the murders changed their story. With little left to tie him firmly to the killings, the first grand jury to hear Kelly's case hung 11-1 in favor of refusing to indict him, and a second panel ultimately freed him. The strongest evidence suggesting that both Jones and Kelly were likely innocent came not from Villisca itself but from other Midwest communities, where a bizarre chain of axe murders in 1911 and 1912 pointed to a transient serial killer at work. Researcher Beth Klingensmith proposed that as many as 10 incidents, all occurring near railway tracks but in locations as far apart as Rainier, Washington, and Monmouth, Illinois, might be connected. In several cases, there were striking similarities to the Villisca crime. Special Agent Matthew McClawtrey of the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, was the first to note this pattern in 1913. He believed the series began with the murder of a family of 6 in Colorado Springs in September 1911 and continued with incidents in Monmouth, Illinois, where the murder weapon was a pipe, and Ellsworth, Kansas. These attacks resulted in the deaths of 3 and 5 people, respectively. 2 more murders occurred in Paola, Kansas, where Roland Hudson and his unfaithful wife were killed just 4 days before the Villisca killings. McClawtrey theorized that the spree culminated in December 1912 with the brutal murders of Mary Wilson and her daughter Georgia Moore in Columbia, Missouri. His theory implicated Henry Lee Moore, Georgia's son and a convict with a history of violence, as responsible for the entire series. While it's not necessary to believe Henry Lee Moore was the serial killer to consider the string of Midwest axe murders, there are intriguing similarities that might connect the Villisca massacre to other crimes. Moore, now rarely considered a prime suspect, was an unsavory character, released from a reformatory in Kansas shortly before the axe murders began, arrested in Jefferson City, Missouri, shortly after they ended, and eventually convicted of the Columbia murders. However, his motive in the Columbia case was greed. He planned to obtain the deeds to his family house. It's rare for a wandering serial killer to return home and kill his own family, casting doubt on his involvement in the other murders. Nonetheless, analysis of the sequence of murders, and several others not considered by McClaughry, reveals striking comparisons. The use of an axe in nearly every case might not be remarkable in itself, given the prevalence of such implements in rural districts. Yet, other similarities among the crimes are harder to dismiss. In 8 of the 10 cases, the murder weapon was found abandoned at the scene. In 7, there was a railway line nearby. 3, including Villisca, occurred on a Sunday night. Just as significant, perhaps, for cases, Paula, Villisca, Rainier, and a solitary murder in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, involved killers who covered their victims' faces. 3 murderers washed at the scene, and at least 5 lingered in the murder house. In 2 other homes, those of the Ellsworth and Paula murders, the killer used lamps with the chimney laid aside and the wick bent down, just as in Villisca. Whether all these murders were connected remains a puzzle. Some evidence fits patterns, while other pieces do not. For instance, how might a stranger to Villisca have so unerringly located Joe and Sarah Moore's bedroom by low lamplight, ignoring the children's rooms until the adults were safely dead? On the other hand, the use of the flat of the axe blade to strike the fatal initial blows suggests the murderer had previous experience. Any deep cut with the sharp edge was more likely to lodge the axe in the wound, making it riskier to attack a sleeping couple. The Paula murders bear striking similarities to Villisca beyond the adapted lamp use. In both cases, odd incidents the same night suggest the killer may have attempted to strike twice. In Villisca, at 2:10 a.m. on the night of the murders, telephone operator Xenia Delaney heard footsteps approaching and an unknown hand trying her locked door. In Paula, a second family was awakened by a lamp chimney falling, and they saw an unknown man escaping through a window. The strangest similarity, however, was the behavior of the unknown murderer of William Showman, his wife Pauline, and their 3 children in Ellsworth, Kansas, in October 1911. In the Ellsworth case, a chimneyless lamp illuminated the murder scene, and a heap of clothing had been placed over the Showman's telephone. Why bother to muffle a phone unlikely to ring at 1 in the morning? Perhaps, as one student of the murders posits, for the same reason the Villisca murderer covered his victims' faces and draped cloths over mirrors and windows, because he feared his dead victims were somehow conscious of his presence. Might the Ellsworth killer have covered the telephone out of the same desperate desire to ensure no eyes were watching him in the murder house?